Maybe you've reached a point where your mind became so obsessed with someone that you started wondering if something was wrong with you. Why can't I stop thinking about this person? Why does my brain keep replaying the same moments, the same messages, the same tiny details, over and over again? Even when part of you wants to move on, something inside you keeps pulling you back. And after a while, it stops feeling like love. It starts feeling like obsession. But here's the strange part. Psychology suggests that this may have less to do with the person, and more to do with the way your brain reacts to emotional uncertainty. Because the human brain doesn't handle unfinished emotional experiences very well. Especially when someone gave you just enough attention to make you emotionally attached, but never enough to make you feel secure. And once that loop begins, your mind can get trapped in a cycle that feels almost impossible to escape. And this is where it gets even stranger. Because the brain doesn't become obsessed with everyone. Some people leave your mind almost instantly. Others stay there for months. Sometimes even years. So why does the brain become emotionally trapped by certain people, while letting others go so easily? Psychologists believe the answer may come from the way uncertainty affects the reward system inside the brain. The human brain is constantly trying to predict emotional outcomes. It wants certainty. It wants to know, will this person come back? Will they text again? Do they care or not? But when someone becomes inconsistent, the brain starts paying even more attention. And strangely, this uncertainty can create a stronger emotional attachment than consistency ever could. Psychologists call this intermittent reinforcement. It happens when emotional rewards appear unpredictably. Sometimes the person gives attention. Sometimes they disappear. Sometimes they seem deeply interested, then suddenly distant again. And because the brain never knows what comes next, it keeps searching for another emotional reward. Very similar to the way slot machines keep people addicted. Not because people win every time, but because they win just enough to keep hoping. And the brain reacts to emotional uncertainty in a very similar way. One message can suddenly change your entire mood. One small moment of attention can make you feel relieved again. One notification can instantly pull your mind back into the connection. And after a while, you start noticing everything. The delay between messages, the tone of a sentence, a different emoji, a colder reply. Your brain starts treating tiny emotional signals like something deeply important. Because uncertainty keeps the mind in constant anticipation. And anticipation is one of the strongest dopamine triggers the brain can experience. That's why emotional obsession can feel impossible to control. Because after some point, the brain is no longer attached only to the person. It becomes attached to the possibility of emotional reward. And this is where obsession becomes even more complicated. Because after a certain point, it's no longer completely about the real person. It becomes about what the person started to represent inside your mind. The brain slowly begins filling emotional gaps with imagination. You start attaching meaning to small moments, small conversations, tiny gestures, brief attention, and over time, the emotional version of the person inside your head can become much bigger than the real person themselves. Because the mind is not obsessed with facts. It becomes obsessed with emotional possibility. What they could mean, what they could become, what the relationship could eventually turn into. And the less clarity you have, the more space imagination has to grow. That's why obsession often feels so real. Because emotionally, your brain is not reacting only to the person anymore. It's reacting to the story your mind built around them. A story filled with hope, uncertainty, fantasy, and emotional projection. And this is why people sometimes become deeply attached to someone they barely even know. An artist, a stranger, someone they only spoke to a few times. Because the emotional brain does not always separate reality from emotional significance. If something feels emotionally important enough, the brain can start treating it as psychologically real. And at some point, you stop obsessing over the real person. You start obsessing over what they represent inside your mind. And some people are more vulnerable to this than others, especially people who spend a lot of time inside their own minds. Some people don't just feel emotions quickly. They carry them for a long time. Some minds don't just experience emotions. They stay inside them longer. And when someone grows up in emotionally unpredictable environments, the brain can become extremely sensitive to emotional inconsistency later in life. Always analyzing. Always searching for signs. Always trying to understand what changed. Especially in people who rarely feel deeply understood by others. Because emotional obsession is not always created by love alone. Sometimes it's created by the feeling that someone finally touched a part of you that usually stays unseen. And this is when the mental loop begins. You replay conversations in your head, reread old messages, imagine scenarios that never happened. Because uncertainty keeps the brain searching for closure. The mind keeps trying to solve the situation emotionally. And every small moment of attention creates hope again, which pulls the brain right back into the cycle. Because part of your mind never fully leaves the situation. It keeps waiting for emotional resolution that never completely arrives. And maybe that's the most dangerous part of emotional obsession. Not the overthinking, not the waiting, not even the emotional exhaustion, but the fact that it can feel deeply meaningful. Because when something affects you this intensely, the brain starts assuming it must mean something real. But emotional intensity is not always emotional truth. Sometimes the obsession is not created by what actually happened. It's created by everything that almost happened. The conversations that felt unfinished. The connection that never became clear. The version of the relationship your mind kept imagining. And that's why people sometimes stay emotionally attached to someone who barely gave them anything real. Because the mind keeps replaying the possibility, not the reality. And after a while, letting go no longer feels like losing a person. It feels like losing the emotional future your mind created around them. Sometimes the brain keeps holding on, not because something was truly meant to happen, but because emotionally, it never fully finished processing what it lost. And when a connection feels unfinished, the mind keeps returning to it, searching for clarity that never fully came. But that doesn't mean you're broken. And it doesn't mean your feelings were fake. It simply means your brain became emotionally trapped inside uncertainty. And once you understand that, something starts to change. Because you stop seeing the obsession as proof that this person was meant for you. And start seeing it for what it often really is. A mind that got stuck trying to resolve something emotionally unfinished. Sometimes, understanding the loop is the first step toward finally escaping it. And maybe the strangest part of all is how many people have experienced this without ever knowing what was happening inside their own minds. So if this video felt a little too familiar, you're probably not alone.